And we're going to focus now on reimagining work in a digital-first world. The challenges of the pandemic have created an opportunity to radically transform both work and business. But as we look to the future, how do organisations move past the early lift and shift efforts of transitioning to work from home from the office to a more fundamental transformation? What is involved in that process? Here to share what's working and, just as importantly, what is not, as well as to outline his thoughts on how to enable distributed teams to be more aligned, more agile and more productive. Please welcome Brian Elliott, VP of Slack's Future Forum. Good morning, Brian.
Hey, hello and welcome. Hey, great to be here with you.
Yeah, lovely to have you with us. Many thanks for joining us. It's great to have you. Now, listen, you're going to be talking about the transition that we've seen over the past 6 months. Well, I mean, I know that this transition has been coming for a while now, but certainly been accelerated over the last 6 months. What are the most interesting developments that you've seen during that process of acceleration?
Yeah, so what I'm going to do today is share with you some of the changes and challenges that we've seen. So I run Future Forum, which is a new consortium backed by Slack. We're dedicated to helping companies think about the current challenges as massive opportunities. We think there's 3 really key things that are going to come out of this that I'll talk you through a bit today about the research that backs this up and how we got here. But one is, distributed teams working together in hybrid environments. The opportunity for companies to think about and tap into much broader, much more distributed talent pools. The second is, we've lived in this sort of 9-to-5 office-based, orthodoxy for decades and decades. What the recent challenges have shown us is real massive opportunity to rethink flexibility in when people work as well as where people work, to recombine asynchronous and synchronous communications. And the last, and definitely not least from our perspective at Slack, is the ability for you to rethink what is headquarters. That physical office building that used to be the center and the seat of power is now a much more level playing field if you think about digital as your new headquarters. So I'd love to get into even more of that with you today. Yeah,
absolutely. And we will absolutely give you the opportunity to do that. I think everybody's working in a digital way now. This summit is probably testament to that. So without further ado, Brian, I'm going to hand over to you. We will be back here with some audience questions towards the end of the session. Brian Elliott, over to you.
Great. Thanks very much. So what I'm going to share with you today is some of our content and information about what we've been digging into here. I've spent over 2 decades myself leading companies and leading teams in technology. And no matter what the company was, whether it was a startup or whether it was Google or Slack today, the one thing that I learned is your ability to hire really good people, to bring them together, to get them motivated and aligned and going in a common direction together was really critical to your success. Basically, culture eats strategy from an ongoing business basis. Back in March, what happened across the globe is everybody made massive changes. Over the course of basically a week, people moved work from office buildings into people's homes. But what happened really was just sort of a lift and shift. We took 9 to 5 days, calendars worth of meetings, and we shoved them into people's homes and tossed everybody into video conferences all day long. And so what we wanted to do is dig a little bit deeper into what was working and what wasn't from a personal perspective with workers around the globe. So we surveyed 9,000 knowledge workers, US, UK, Germany, France, Australia, and Japan. We're going to do this every quarter and continue to update it about what was working and what wasn't for them. The challenges, the benefits are the things that we all see. Work-life balance on average for most people is better. We've managed to cut the commute. People are saving a little bit of money between the commute and even the lunch out type of things. But the challenges are real and fairly persistent. Number one, Wi-Fi connectivity. By the way, that cuts across all income levels, sort of somewhat surprisingly. The number 2 one, though, is deep. It's the most fundamental issue, which is belonging, that sense of social isolation that can happen when people are off in their own environment, where they don't feel as much like they're part of a team. And that's one that we'll come back to as I talk through some of the research results. Third was actually kind of mixed depending on who you asked, but what came out pretty consistently was staying focused. It's pretty understandable when you think about what everybody's living through, the twin challenges of trying to work while living at home, while in a pandemic, while economic challenges are going on, and the number of people that were either crammed into small apartments, single people who didn't have the space to get work done effectively, or working parents at home dealing with children who weren't in school and their work challenges. The ability to stay focused was really challenging. What's surprising is, given all of that, It still changed people's expectations. People have radically rethought where they want to work. Only 12% of those 9,000 people we surveyed want to come back to an office 5 days a week on an ongoing basis. But not everybody wants to be remote either. Only 16% want to be remote and never come back into an office. The vast majority, most of us, want flexibility. We want hybrid environments. We want the ability to tap into an office environment, into shared space for relationships and team bonding when we need it, but the ability to work from home far more often, to get the balance back in our lives, to spend more time with family, and to cut that commute out. We wanted to go a layer deeper than this. So one of the things that we did is we took the 4,700 people who'd been working remotely for 5 months at that point and dug deeper on what was working for them and what wasn't. And we asked them to compare what their remote work experience was like versus the office work environment. And we built what we're, one of the things that jumps out at us on this is that request to move to flexible and hybrid environments is where we get the opportunity for more distribution of talent and bringing people together. But the challenges that they're facing, even in those environments, are real. So this is where we dug in from a research perspective more deeply and built out what we call the Remote Employee Experience Index. The Remote Employee Experience Index takes everyone who was working remotely for that 5-month period and asks them to weight their remote work experience versus their in-office experience. What was better and what was worse? And what you can see is people's work-life balance, on average, was much better. Their stress and anxiety about work was actually lower working remotely. And that's pretty interesting when you think about the challenges that we're all facing today. On average, productivity for most people was better than it was working in the office. A lot of other studies have verified this and backed this one up as well. The big challenge, though, came back to that sense of belonging, that sense of camaraderie, that I'm part of a team and I'm not out there on my own. Still, overall, people's work arrangements and their satisfaction with working remotely was better than it was when they were in an office environment. We think this is why people are actually going to change how they work and where they work. And this is why it's going to be really important to take the lessons that we've learned from the past 8 months and apply them and think about more fundamental changes that we can make to how and where work happens. Let me give you a couple of other examples of how this actually breaks that down, though, because those benefits and detractions aren't equally spread across different groups. One of the first areas that we actually looked at was race and ethnicity. And looking at the respondents, particularly in the States, Black employees, Latinx employees, and Asian Americans had real challenges, fundamental issues of not feeling as well supported by their managers, by their teams, or by their companies as their white colleagues. This reflects some of the racial divisions that we're seeing in society at large. On the positive side, though, that sense of belonging that was red for the majority of people was actually red for white employees. Black employees, Latinx employees, and Asian American employees in the US actually felt a positive sense of belonging working remotely, more so than they did in the office. We're going deeper on this. We're starting to talk with academic researchers who have pointed out that the cost of code switching, the challenge for people that come from different communities that then have to come into a white dominant, a white majority community and mimic and act and use language that's used in that community is a tax. It's a cost for all of them. If the ability to actually let people work more often from home in their own communities in places where they feel more comfortable, to take breaks during the day from that white majority way of talking and behaving, gives them a better sense of belonging. That's a massive opportunity for all of us to rethink how we bring together more diverse and inclusive members of our society to get work done. Second group that really saw an impact was women with children. Women with children, more so, we like to say parents with children. I'm a proud dad myself, but women with children in the US and the UK were far more challenged than men with children. This wasn't as true in other countries. In Australia, Germany, and France, it was a more level playing field, partly because there's different infrastructure available to people in terms of where childcare comes from. The challenge that you're seeing play out right now in real life is that women are exiting the workforce faster than men, especially in the US. Companies are being asked to respond to this. You have choices around how you respond. Providing childcare is challenging when childcare is just hard to provide. But flexible work schedules, the ability for people to break that 9-to-5 standard, to actually time shift when they do their individual contributor work, is a really key way to unlock the potential, especially for women with children in today's environment. Third group of people that were negatively impacted, middle managers. Senior executives and individual contributors both scored better on nearly every dimension in our survey. Middle managers struggled with their sense of belonging because they often don't have the same networks as senior executives, and they no longer have necessarily the sense of team that comes from being an individual contributor. The other thing that middle managers struggled with a lot was staying on top of their team's work. The ability for them to feel like in an interdisciplinary world, they're on top of what their team is after, how things are going, and what the progress looks like was a real core challenge. This one correlated a lot with the sort of tech leader versus tech laggard stance of your company. The more likely that if you're working in a tech leader, it was much more likely as a middle manager that you felt the ability to stay on top of your team's workload, and that you're able, importantly, to do that with digital tools and not calling yet more status meetings and contributing to yet more video conference burnout. So what we've done is we've taken all of this, the learnings that we've gotten from the index, and all of the different challenges that people are facing in different groups, and started thinking about what can we do to rethink people, processes for work, and places. How do we go from a simple lift and shift of moving meetings into people's homes to a more fundamental way of rethinking how and where work gets done? From a people perspective, this has never been more true. Top talent doesn't show up to punch a clock and get a paycheck. Top talent goes to places, especially from a millennial generation perspective, where they understand the purpose of the company and they want to contribute to that broader purpose. Executives get it. You can see this in the survey results. Purpose matters to people, it matters to companies in terms of getting people aligned. If you think about the challenge for middle managers, it's back to how do they lead with purpose and not feel like their job is simply to track productivity, attendance, and whether or not people are showing up for work. That means that we need to rethink what skills we expect managers to have as leaders. If a company wants to be led with purpose, the first job of a manager needs to be creating clarity. How do you take that purpose from a company perspective and share information and knowledge transparently with your organization, allowing teams to come together to fulfill the mission of the company? That means that you want to use tools that have openness as a standard, because sharing information and knowledge is one of the key ways that you actually build and create that clarity for your team to operate. Second foundation is that clarity and that transparency is all about inspiring trust. The openness that comes with sharing information is a critical part of that, but so is vulnerability. What's happened over the course of the past 6 months is we've welcomed people into our homes. I've got a lovely green screen that gives a nice background at the moment, but other times people have seen the kid, my kid running around the house, they've seen the dog, and this has happened in everybody's lives. We're all getting very used to being actually much more ourselves at work. Inspiring trust is about sharing information, being transparent about what's going on, but also letting people know that you care about them individually and that you're there to help them and build them going forward. Last and not least is unlocking potential. It's the fact that you need to not only inspire people, but actually help them hold themselves accountable to outcomes. What are the goals that your company is trying to achieve more broadly? Not measuring output or productivity, but measuring the outcomes that you as a team are trying to attain. That's one of the most critical things to unlocking that potential. So when we brought this back and looked at how do we want managers to behave and what are we seeing in the survey results, the two actually tie quite nicely. The things that actually solved belonging, that took it from a red to a green in our survey results, were not holding more status meetings. In fact, holding the weekly status meetings so you can keep track of what everyone's working on actually detracted from a sense of belonging as well as productivity. Moving that into digital tools helped. What does help is team celebrations, social activities, adapting different ways to actually bring people together, even in a digital venue. Whether that's using a water cooler channel, having a Zoom meeting with a happy hour, using Donut, which is a great app that actually pairs people up on a dynamic ongoing basis. Finding ways to bring that social aspect back into work is what helps bolster belonging. Second part, though, is process. So if you think about that status meeting and the challenge that it creates, it kind of looks like this. Most of your calendars probably at one point or time have actually looked like this on an ongoing basis. That 9 to 5 jammed calendar where you're sitting there looking at your day and going, there's probably an hour and a half where I can get my work done, and otherwise I'm doing it at night. This has gotten even worse in the course of the pandemic and the challenges because people are now dealing with much different challenges at home as well. It's finally time to really fundamentally change and shift how we think about where work gets done. Flexible work schedules, companies that actually allow people flexibility to break the norms of 9 to 5, were one of the most powerful tools that we found in our survey. It boosted people's work-life balance, it lowered their stress levels, it dramatically increased productivity, and it brought that negative sense of belonging to a neutral. Flexible work schedules aren't the easiest thing for most people to think about though, because you're very used to a 9 to 5. So specifically, the recommendations are things like think about how you enable for more bursty work in your team. For example, my team operates under a norm that says we don't schedule meetings outside of 10 a.m. to 3 p.m. California time because that's where we're centered. We avoid other meetings outside of that. And we actually ask people to think about like have your notifications on during that time, but off at other times. Create space for the second part, which is that solo, flexible maker time. The ability for you to put your head down to actually think about something without distractions, the ability to get into flow and to focus on a core piece of work is really critical. That actually goes to how you think about how you get work done more broadly. In order to make all of these things work, you also are going to have to blow up your calendar. You're going to have to sacrifice some of those meetings. I've tried doing the calendar default clean out a few times over the course of my career. But one of the things that will actually help it make it stick is actually thinking about what rules you want to have. How do you start using the right tools for the right set of conversations? We at Slack have actually moved entire meetings with hundreds of people in them into digital channels with really clear rules about how and where do you raise questions, how do you ask for help on things from a status perspective and bring it back together. Communications, how do you share the team's all hands becomes really critical also. How do you go from, on a global basis, not thinking about the people in the room, but thinking about your entire team on a globally distributed basis? Rich multimedia, the ability for you to share conversations across an entire organization, to take questions AMA style, and to allow people to respond and interact and even digest that content over a 24-hour cycle around the world is really important to making everybody feel like they're all part of one single team. So from a process perspective, the most important thing is thinking about flexibility and how you allow that. That means you have to start thinking about how do you break some of the norms of work always being synchronous and always in meetings and allow people the flexibility to work asynchronously and then save that core team time for problem solving and team belonging and getting everybody together. Last but not least is place. Your headquarters, like Slack's headquarters, probably looks something like this. You actually had a single building, even though you might have had distributed offices around the globe, that was the headquarters. Executives sat at the top of the building, and classically, the way this would work is information would pass from that executive suite down throughout the rest of the organization. That mode of operating, that norm of operating is one that we've got a real opportunity to break in the current environment. It's a chance for us to think about how do we unbundle the office? How do we go from an executive suite that is centrally located where people's careers are literally tied to it, to thinking about how digital can become your headquarters? So I'll give you an example. We had teams that worked with me that were in Denver. We were in San Francisco. I had a leader in Denver that would come to San Francisco twice a month. He's got 5 kids. It would be a real material burden on his work-life balance and on his family. This change, this shift from being in offices, and even though we allowed for flexibility, to thinking about not that office, that 500 Howard building in San Francisco as headquarters, but thinking about Slack as headquarters for us was a real opportunity for us to level the playing field. It was a real opportunity for people like him to think about how their career aspirations can continue to grow without having to travel twice a month. How you can think about distributed teams that actually work together on an ongoing basis and not have people even in those remote offices feel like they're second-class citizens. So unbundling the office is really key. And what's going to be even more critical as people start coming back is thinking about how you come back. What rules do you set up about where your executives show up, about how you run meetings with everybody dialing in on laptops to avoid that re-centralization that goes back to making remote workers and people in remote offices feel like second-class citizens. The other really key part to this is actually thinking about how all the tools that you use get shared into one location. Average enterprise company uses over 1,000 different SaaS tools. The majority of employees spend 30 minutes a day or more swapping between applications looking for data and information. That number of tools is great because it makes teams more productive, but you need a place to share that content and information. So at the end of the day, digital needs to become your new headquarters, not only from like how your teams correspond with each other, but it's the place in which you actually share content and information. It's where that all hands video gets posted. It's where your employee resource groups come together. It's where project teams come together. It's where data is shared no matter what the tool. And it's how you actually think about bridging and building all of these teams. I happen to think that Slack is a really good choice for all of that. There's multiple ways you can do this, but Slack has actually got the ability to span across entire organizations. And what we've seen over the course of the past 6 months is a dramatic shift in people's behavior. This is a survey of Slack customers that showed that they dramatically increased their productivity, but also reduced email, and importantly, given the current environment, a 21% reduction in meetings. So, 3 recommendations. Number 1, think about distributed teams and hybrid work environments. Think about how you can use this as an opportunity to tap into broader talent pools geographically and bring them together. Second, flexible work schedules. Breaking the synchronous 9 to 5 day worth of meetings and allowing people the flexibility, if you're a morning person, to do your work earlier on in the day, if you're a night person, to do it later, and get out of that 9 to 5 habit, has real opportunity to unlock potential for teams and specifically for people who are really challenged in the current environment. And third, to make all this work, you need to rethink what headquarters is. You need to move to a globally distributed digital headquarters to make your teams more effective, more engaged, and happier together. So that's the presentation and that's the content. Would love to take any questions.
Yeah, great stuff. Many thanks, Brian. I can tell you we do have lots of questions lined up. Before we go to the audience, I just want to ask you a quick question myself. And it kind of regards innovation in a remote setting, in a distributed workforce, and how you enable the innovation process when everybody's working in a slightly different way to perhaps they were previously.
Yeah, it's one of those great questions, and there's some really interesting studies behind it. One of the suppositions at times, though, is that we all miss the whiteboard. And we miss the brainstorming in the office. There are lots of academic studies that show that version of brainstorming, especially where you had people who weren't necessarily well trained in how to do it, was actually completely ineffective. What it tends towards is, you've got a group, think about how this happened. It's happened to every one of us more than once. You've got a group of people together in a room and somebody goes up to the board and takes the pen and draws a 2x2 on it and asks people to contribute to it. And immediately what happens after the first person speaks or the second person speaks is you start doing groupthink. You start prejudging whether or not you want to toss your idea in because does it fit? Or how are people going to react to it? Or is it on track? Or maybe somebody else chimes in and starts automatically questioning the ideas. If you think about what you want to do, you want to combine asynchronous capabilities with what you pull together. There are great tools. You can do this, by the way, in a Google Doc or a Word document. You can do it using a tool like Miro or Mural that are both really good whiteboarding tools, but start your team asynchronously. Start the process by saying to your team, here's the topic that we want to get into. Ask them to do an hour's worth of work ahead of time, notifications off, heads down, thinking about stuff, then bring that content back together. When we did this remote employee experience index, we did exactly that. The research team gave us the results. It was a 65-page long document filled with really great graphs, charts, and insights. There were 6 of us that then took the time. We took a couple of hours each, went through it, and what we asked is that everybody come in with what were the 5 things that you thought were most important coming out of this, and what were the 5 things that surprised you. We then, at the beginning of the meeting, threw all of that into a single shared document, spent 10 minutes reviewing what everybody else's ideas were and thoughts were, and what came out of it was far more specific ideas and insights more effectively than if we'd done that together. So from a creativity and innovation, what you want to be able to do is allow people to actually do that asynchronous work, but then bring it together and talk about it. And there are great ways to do that, even in a digitally distributed environment.
Yeah, perfect. Great advice. Many thanks, Brian. So I think we've got our first question from the audience. We've got Julie from Thrillworks. Good morning, Julie.
Morning. Thanks, Brian, for the talk. As a mom of 2 little kids, I totally empathize with that. So we have Slack at our company, and it's quite effective to stay connected. However, I do find that sometimes you can over-index with the channels and kind of get overwhelmed by the number of messages that are happening, and especially if you're kind of working across different clients and things like that. So any advice for how to kind of better manage that flow of communication and, make sure you can focus on the highest priority items?
Yeah, so 2 things. One is setting norms with your team about how you actually set up notifications in the first place. So for example, I actually subscribe to literally thousands of channels inside of Slack, but the stuff that I pay attention to is when someone @mentions me. So we've worked a lot on this internally and with customers as well. If you want to get my attention on something inside of a channel, and it's important that I do so over the span of a day or whatever time frame, then please mention me directly. Otherwise, the expectation is I'll get to it when I get to it. The second thing is sections. So the ability for you in Slack to actually organize your work into groupings, I've personally found to be hugely beneficial, because it allows me to take the things that are the most important, group them together, including whether or not I'm getting direct messages at the top in my field of view. And then otherwise, the rest of the stuff is less important, then I'll get to it on a later basis. The third and last, but definitely not least, is thinking about how you use notifications. So one of the things that we work on as a team is thinking about turn notifications off when you want to be heads down in your work. And it's perfectly cool to do that. And that's exactly what we should expect people to do. So thinking about norms for how you mention people, group your channels together, and shut the notifications off when you need to put your head down and get some work done.
Love that. Thanks, Brian. Actually, I just found out about the sections last week, and it's been a life changer.
We launched that, by the way, in April during in the early stages of the whole shift and move from work from home, and people were worried that it was going to be a challenge, putting out new user experience during the pandemic, but it's been a real boost.
Great stuff. Many thanks, Julie. Many thanks. Up next, we have Rajesh. Rajesh from Starbucks. Rajesh.
Hey, Brian. Thank you. That was a great talk. I think you covered most of the points and spot on in terms of organizing yourself, the mail and everything else. I think the other thing that I've found is you've got to set some boundaries at home in terms of where you take your work. And which part of the house you work from, because I think it's very easy to get carried away for the work to follow you even after 5 o'clock in the evening. So you got to set some boundaries in terms of working in one location if you can, closing your laptop and then just walking away. So I appreciate that. I know this question came up in the chat too, but I think something that's top of mind for me and my team lately has been we have a great culture when we are in person working in the building. You can see the culture, you can feel the culture. It's the coffee shop, coffee house culture. How do you relay and nurture that company culture in this virtual environment, especially as you're onboarding new employees into the workforce? Any nuggets of information or wisdom that you can pass along?
That's a great question. First, appreciate your first observation. There are people who are integrators and people who are separators. I'm personally an integrator, but think about what separation you need at home to make sure that you don't turn it on 24/7, which is completely unproductive. From a team culture building perspective, there's a lot of this comes back to how do you put more intention behind what you do. So the thing that we did when we had offices, especially with new employees, is some of it just happened by happenstance because you put people through the onboarding program, and then maybe they got a mentor, maybe not, but then you plunk them down in a row of open office space cubicles, and they had a group of people around them that they would have a conversation with. And some of those would work out to be really great relationships, and some of those would be people would lean on and others wouldn't. With the shift to remote and what we've had to deal with for the past 8 months, it means you have to bring a lot more intentionality to how you think about hiring and onboarding people. Slack has now onboarded over 20% of our employee base since March. And so we've done a lot to actually think about how do we not only rebuild the onboarding program, but thinking through things like what's the mentoring program look like? How do we pair people up? How do we make sure that we bring more attention to new employees being paired with more senior employees? What types of teams we're plunking them down into that already have established patterns of how they work together. The second is from a culture perspective, thinking about the different tools that you can use and apply. So the water cooler channels and even Giphy inside of Slack, I will confess, I had early on conversations, over the past couple of years before all this happened with CIOs of major companies that would look at Giphy and go, why does that matter and why are people using it? And now the same people are going, thank God for the water cooler channel and for Giphy, because that social expression, that ability for you to have the team fun channel and to share, what happened over the course of the weekend and, a funny story or, pictures of the kids is really critical to helping teams feel like, and people feel like they're part of a team. So things like, the water cooler channel, Giphy, and products like Donut that pair people up are really helpful on this too. I do think as we come out of this, what you're going to find is that we're going to mix up the physical get-togethers again as well, because those really are important. And they're not important. They are, we talked about creativity and innovation. There's places where they can be helpful in other ways. The most critical part, though, is going to be that sort of recharging of emotional batteries, of bringing people back together. Even companies that are virtual first and all virtual are missing the fact that every, once a quarter, once every 6 months, they could get people together to sort of get that boost of, energy that comes from being in a physical shared space together.
Thanks, Brian.
Yeah, fantastic. Many thanks, Brian. And thank you so much for the question, Rajesh. So up next, we have Dan from the Travel Corporation. Morning, Dan.
Hey, good morning. Hi, everyone. Thank you, Brian. A very fascinating session and highly relevant for us. What I wanted to ask you is that, we've got 3,000 people working remotely now for the first time. And many companies, as you've certainly experienced working at Slack, have a policy of working at the office, like Marissa Mayer at Yahoo. And then you had the camp that was more Richard Branson, you can work anywhere. And I think that's been even more emphasized now. And I think Reed Hastings is an example of where at Netflix, a company you might expect to be focused on working remotely, made the comment somewhat in jest that as soon as there's a vaccine, people will be back in the office 12 hours later. And so there's certainly corporate leaders who have a very clear focus on getting people back to the office. And one of the key reasons for that is productivity. So my question for you, and you mentioned it and referenced a number of studies that have been done. And I just wanted to understand if how you track that productivity. So some of those stats you shared, to showcase that back to an executive team to highlight how truly productive people are at working remotely so that you can maintain more of a hybrid model with the right approach. That's my first question. And just on the back of that, given that clearly people are very successful at working remotely and certain issues do arise, you kind of referenced a few with when burnout occurs or people are just overworked because of that sense of trying to be productive and the hours they're putting in, they're working harder than ever under a lot of challenges and constraints. And so I'm just curious to know how you have seen companies successfully manage that. And the one example I've seen is with Levi's doing no meetings on Fridays. Staff members get every Friday of the month off. So what have you seen from the corporate clients you have at Slack with how companies have successfully managed that?
Yeah, it's a great question. It's a hard topic. So from the productivity perspective, our own study was getting at people's assessment of their productivity and how they were performing and what they were doing. We've also dug in and done other studies in terms of looking at data. So for example, with engineering teams, you can look at, Jira tickets closed. With customer service organizations, you can look at customer satisfaction. You can also look at tickets closed and things like that, all of which have actually been, we've done this, McKinsey's done it, BCG's done it. There's been a number of consulting studies show that productivity on average is actually up. Some of that comes at risk of burnout. Some of that is that people are working extra hours and are, charging at work on a harder basis at times. And so finding ways to make sure that you've got that balance in terms of how you get, people working together productively is a key part of it. Executives at the end of the day will make the decision, and it should make the decision not on productivity, but on outcomes. So, this is like, there's a long running, set of threads that go underneath this, but individual productivity, the number of hours that you work or the number of widgets that you churn out is actually less important than whether or not you're getting the outcome that you want. Is revenue growing? Are you cutting cost? Are you making customers happier? Is your net promoter score going up? And if you look, and companies that are digging deeper on, given the shift that we've seen, are we actually producing better results, are more likely to stick with it. From a company perspective, I use Slack as an example first. A lot of people now assume that Slack's been a remote, first company for a long time. When we started this back in March, 3% of Slack employees were fully remote. And so we were not at all in that camp. And in fact, what happened is over the course of the first 6 weeks, a lot of our executives came together, started looking at the performance of their teams, what they were doing, what they were capable of doing, and made a really core realization that was less about productivity than it was about a fundamental understanding that all of a sudden, instead of trying to attract and bring people into San Francisco and New York, we had the ability to open up and hire people across a much wider geographic field. And so that ability to tap into talent actually is what changed people's minds while looking at the data and understanding that the productivity was just as good, if not better, as it was before. So I think what's going to happen is you are going to have companies that are going to sit in different spectrums. You'll have companies like Dropbox that's gone virtual first, where they're talking about the fact that, you know, they will have some portion of their offices remain as studio space to bring people back into. You will have some companies that sit on the other side of this that will say, you know, I believe I want to get everybody back into the Manhattan corporate headquarters because I know that they're productive there, and that's just the way that we're used to working, and I want it back. And there are reasons why you want to have some portions of people that are dealing with, you know, whether it's lab equipment, services, heavy duty animation that may require some of that. Most companies are going to end up in a hybrid position, partly because they realize the opportunity to tap into talent. And the other is going to be, you know, if you're Netflix and you're Reed Hastings, you can probably attract the talent. But if you are not willing to be flexible, and if employees want flexibility, there are plenty of studies that show that that's one of the key attributes of what people look for in an employer. If more employers are more open to more flexibility, then talent will migrate to those companies.
That's great. Thank you, Brian. Really appreciate that.
Yeah, fantastic. And thank you for the question, Dan. So up next, I believe we have Mark from Reactor. Morning, Mark.
Yes. Hello. Brian, thank you for a great presentation and an extremely relevant topic. One of the things that you mentioned that surprised me was the fact that middle managers seemed like they felt the most disenfranchised among all the groups that you had mentioned. So I'm curious if you think that this shift to hybrid environments and distributed teams will either eliminate the need for middle managers or force them to recast themselves in different roles? Or said another way, do you think this will create a shift to push organizations into more of a self-managing situational leadership team model?
I think it'll shift. I think what will shift is what we think a manager is and what we expect out of leaders. I think a lot of the managers that are squeezed in the middle and that are feeling that way are for a couple of reasons. One, they're often people that are newer to the job of management, right? This may be their first managerial job. And if you think about what we tend to do historically, we only, in most functions, in most organizations, there's only one way up, right? The way up is you've got to learn to manage people. And we don't tend to have, in a lot of functions outside of engineering, the expert track as well as the managerial track. I think what we're finding is the combination of like the ability for digital tools to bring broader groups of people together takes some of the more rote and tactical elements out of management and gives us a real opportunity to rethink something. And that something is, think about how you could take the job of management and think about how you create expert track leadership and how you create people leadership. And so if you went from a world in which you had, in the average organization, a really wide band of managers who are maybe managing 2 or 3 people, to a more focused group of people that were managing 6, 8, 10 people on average, you could put a lot more training and backing and capability into those people while still allowing people to move up the organization on an expert track. And I think that started happening in engineering over the course of the past decade in a lot of different companies. It's happening in design. I'm starting to see it happen in fields like product management. If we can do that more broadly, you can rethink and not make that managerial job feel as tactical or as spread among so many people that you can't invest properly in making them capable of being the leaders that they want to be. It's a good, meaty topic, though, Mark. Thanks.
No, thank you. It is certainly worth more conversation.
Yeah,
that's definitely a challenging one.
Great stuff. And many thanks for the question, Mark. Thank you all for your questions. And Brian, thank you so much for sharing your thoughts here this morning. A pleasure to hear them and enjoy the rest of the summit. We look forward to discussing them more as we go further in.
Thanks much. Thanks for having me. It's been great.
Take care, Brian.